In the heart of Barcelona stands a church that feels less like a building and more like a vision still becoming real. The Sagrada Familia does not feel frozen in time. It feels alive, rising, branching, reaching upward. Its story began in 19th century Barcelona, where faith, industry, and ambition were colliding. Construction began in 1882 before Gaudi took over under a more conventional vision. Then in 1883, Antoni Gaudí stepped in, and the project changed forever. He did not simply continue the temple. He reimagined it as the greatest work of his life. What he imagined was not merely a basilica, but a symbolic universe in stone. His design called for a Latin cross basilica with monumental facades, vast naves, and 18 towers arranged in a sacred hierarchy. 12 towers were planned for the apostles, 4 for the evangelists, 1 for the Virgin Mary, and the tallest for Jesus Christ. Gaudi planned the Christ Tower to reach 172.5 meters, high enough to transform Barcelona's skyline, yet still lower than Montjuic. Over time, the Sagrada Familia became Gaudi's life's work. He devoted more and more of his time and imagination to it. To design what could not yet be fully calculated on paper, he turned to models, gravity, and experimentation. By inverting hanging chain models, he found structural forms that could stand in stone with remarkable efficiency. He studied nature not as decoration, but as engineering. That is why the interior would one day feel like a forest, columns rising like trunks, dividing like branches, carrying light upward. The Sagrada Familia was never only an architect's vision. It was also the labor of craftsmen and builders across generations. The first major facade to take shape under Gaudi was the Nativity facade. Unlike a cold monument, this facade overflows with life, plants, animals, movement, joy, and sacred birth carved into stone. The Nativity facade was conceived as a celebration of life, creation, and the joy of the Incarnation. On this facade, stone seems to bloom. Nature is everywhere. Its composition is not random. Like much of the temple, it is ordered symbolically. But Gaudi did not imagine a temple of joy alone. On the opposite side, he planned a facade of suffering, severity, and sacrifice. The Passion facade was meant to feel stripped, almost skeletal, a visual language of pain rather than abundance. Together, the facades reveal one of Gaudi's deepest intentions. This basilica would tell the full Christian drama through stone. As the years passed, Gaudi himself changed. He became more austere, more solitary, and more inseparable from the temple. By the end of his life, many saw him as a man almost consumed by sacred work. Then, in 1926, Gaudi was struck by a tram in Barcelona. He died a few days later, leaving the Sagrada Familia unfinished, but leaving behind a vision so powerful that others would spend generations trying to continue it. After his death, the temple entered a far more uncertain future. His disciples and collaborators tried to carry the work forward, guided by plans, models, notes, and memory. What remained was powerful, but incomplete. Then came the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, the Sagrada Familia was vandalized. Plans and photographs were burned, and plaster models were smashed. It was not only the physical work that suffered. The temple's memory itself was nearly destroyed. For most projects, that might have been the end. For the Sagrada Familia, it became another test of survival. Some materials were saved, and from those fragments, the work began again. What survived was enough to keep the temple alive. After war and loss, construction resumed. Slowly, unevenly, but with one conviction intact: the temple would continue. But continuing the Sagrada Familia was never simple. It meant deciding how to remain faithful to a mind that was no longer there. The question was unavoidable. Were later generations completing Gaudi's vision or interpreting it through their own time? In 1954, work began on the Passion facade, dedicated to the suffering and death of Christ. Its language was deliberately harsher, stripped down, angular, severe. Where the Nativity overflows, the Passion confronts. As the facade developed, its sculptural style sparked debate. That tension is part of the building's history. The Sagrada Familia is not the work of one moment. It is the record of many. And still the work expanded toward the nave, the vaults, the towers, and the immense interior Gaudi had imagined. By the late 20th century, the Sagrada Familia had become an unfinished masterpiece that refused to become a ruin. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Basilica entered a new phase, still unfinished, but advancing with modern precision. The materials remained close to Gaudi's intentions. The difference was in the tools: computers, mechanized stone cutting, and far more precise construction systems. In a way, the digital age did not replace Gaudi's experimental spirit. It extended it. And inside, the great revelation finally emerged. The nave Gaudi had imagined as a forest of stone. These columns do not merely support the building. They rise, divide, and spread like living forms. Color inside the basilica comes not only from the windows, but also from the materials themselves. Light was central to Gaudi's vision. In the Sagrada Familia, sunlight does not simply illuminate space, it transforms it. By 2010, when the nave was covered, the world could finally step inside the heart of Gaudi's great unfinished cathedral. By the early 21st century, the Sagrada Familia had become one of the defining images of Barcelona. That transformation became unmistakable in 2010, when the basilica was consecrated for worship. After more than a century of construction, the world could now see it not only as architecture, but as a functioning basilica. Even so, the great central towers were still unfinished, and the skyline was still evolving. In 2021, the Tower of the Virgin Mary was inaugurated, crowned with its luminous star. That star announced that the Sagrada Familia was still actively becoming what Gaudi had imagined. By 2023, the four towers of the Evangelists had also been inaugurated, bringing the central cluster much closer to completion. At the center of everything stands the Tower of Jesus Christ, designed to rise to 172.5 meters as the highest point of the temple. In February 2026, the upper arm of the cross was put in place, completing the exterior of that central tower. After nearly a century and a half, the Sagrada Familia stands closer than ever to the skyline Gaudi only glimpsed in fragments and models. One of the most remarkable facts about the Sagrada Familia is this: it was conceived as an expiatory temple funded by donations. That means the basilica was built generation after generation through the contributions of ordinary people who would never live to see it completed. Even today, private funding remains central to the project. Part of the temple also carries special international status. Gaudi's work on the Nativity facade and the crypt is included within UNESCO's Works of Antoni Gaudí. The basilica is also one of the most visited monuments in Spain, giving it a rare dual identity: sacred space, building site, and global attraction at once. Outside, it is crowded and photographed endlessly. Inside, it can still feel hushed and overwhelming in its serenity. And then there's the question people keep asking: when will it finally be finished? The answer has shifted repeatedly over time, shaped by funding, technical challenges, and global disruptions. That uncertainty has become part of the legend. The Sagrada Familia is not only monumental in size, it is dense with meaning. Gaudi treated architecture almost like scripture in stone. One of the most famous details is the magic square on the Passion facade, a grid of numbers arranged so that every row and column adds to 33. It is a small element, but it reveals something important. The Sagrada Familia invites the eye to search, decode, and linger. The towers themselves form a hierarchy of meaning: apostles, evangelists, Mary, and Christ, all ordered in a vertical theology of ascent. Even the pinnacles matter. They were designed with bright materials and symbolic forms that make the upper parts of the temple feel celebratory rather than purely monumental. Inside, symbolism continues around the altar and apse. The stained glass was conceived to do more than beautify the interior. It helps narrate spiritual atmosphere through color. What makes the Sagrada Familia so unusual is that its symbolism is not added onto the architecture. It is built into it from the ground up. That is why people return to it again and again. It keeps revealing itself. Over time, Gaudi himself became part of the legend of the temple. He is buried in the crypt of the Sagrada Familia itself, making the temple not just his greatest work, but also his resting place. That has shaped another layer of meaning around the Basilica. Many people do not come here only as tourists, but with a kind of reverence. And yet the temple also raises a difficult question. When later generations continue an unfinished masterpiece, where does preservation end and interpretation begin? For some, the answer lies in fidelity to Gaudi's methods. For others, the later phases inevitably bear the stamp of their own age. That debate is part of what makes the Sagrada Familia historically unique. A single vision carried through many hands, many decades, and many kinds of decision. Even now, the temple remains in motion. Work continues on key elements, including the monumental glory facade. And that reminds us of something important. Finishing the Sagrada Familia has never been only an architectural question. It also touches the life of the city around it. So the Sagrada Familia remains suspended in a rare condition, already one of the world's great monuments, and still not entirely finished. And perhaps that is why it moves people so deeply. It is not a monument that belongs entirely to the past. It is one that still asks something of the future. In the end, the Sagrada Familia is not simply a church in Barcelona. It carries the imagination of Gaudi, the labor of artisans, the patience of generations, and the persistence of a city that never let the vision disappear. Inside, it feels like a forest made sacred. Outside, it rises like a mountain of prayer and stone. Few buildings blur the line so completely between architecture and nature, structure and symbol, engineering and devotion. Barcelona changed around it. Politics changed. Technology changed. Generations passed. And still the Basilica kept rising. Because the Sagrada Familia was never only about finishing a building. It was about carrying a vision across time without letting it die. Not just as stone, not just as design, but as an unfinished act of faith still visible against the sky.